kind of introduction you love hearing until you realize near the end you have to live up to what he said. Thank you very much, and I really like the idea of being an intellectual maverick. I've never heard that before. At dinner tonight I'm going to tell my wife that I'm an intellectual maverick and see what she thinks. I would like to thank SMU and James for inviting me to spend more than 48 hours in Singapore this time, and I'd like to thank Mr. Jawad and Khalifa for making my longer stay possible. I really do appreciate it. I don't know how many times I've been to Singapore over the years, but at least 10, but I enjoy it very much every time I come here. Now let me see if I can figure out, okay, great. This is a subject that I started working on in the early 1990s. And my thinking about the subject has changed very much over the years. It's connected with a major debate in sociology and to some extent political science and economics about what the impact of the transition away from a Soviet-style planning system, planned economy, to a market economy. What impact will that have on social inequality? What impact will that have on social stratification, on patterns of opportunity? And as I'll describe the evolution of my thinking on this subject, let's we move from very simple ideas, and I think overly simplistic ideas, which we all shared at the beginning. And after we've watched some 20 years or more of this transition in many different countries, not just China, we've developed a much more nuanced understanding of what the process of economic change is and how that affects social structure and how that affects inequality. And I think our thinking has really very much advanced over this period. This is a global social revolution, really. It began probably in China in the 1980s, very slowly. It spread and accelerated in 1989, Eastern Europe in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union accelerated this process even further. There are a total of 34 independent nations today that were state socialist in 1988. All of them have experienced fundamental economic and social change. Most of them have experienced some kind of regime change, a shift to some kind of a new political system. 4 of them have maintained largely the same political structures, including China. Now, what happens in this process is that planning bureaucracies have shrunk or disappeared. That includes China. Welfare and employment guarantees have been drastically reduced for the working population. Housing and services are now supplied by the market, not by work organizations or by the government. Long-standing bans on private enterprise of any kind and private property have completely disappeared in all of these countries. Large reserves of private wealth have gradually been formed through time. And in many of these countries, there have been extensive restructurings of old state-owned firms involving layoffs and decline in the traditional guaranteed employment and welfare of these systems. And you also have accelerated migration, rural to urban and international as part of this. Now, when we first started to talk about this, and here I'll start with what the sociologists were saying, but it wasn't too much different from the way that economists early on were thinking about it. We focused on the mode of distribution in the economy. We're moving from a planned economy to a market economy, which means that there's competition, and that's the way we thought about it. And there's a famous economic sociologist, Karl Polanyi, that's sort of the icon of economic sociology, and he had a typology of different types of economic systems, and he invented a contrast between redistributive economies, which is what a state socialist economy is, and a market economy, and that's the way we thought about it. Some of the early writers, Ivan Szélenyi, an emigre sociologist from Hungary who made a career in the United States, made this into a template for understanding how do we figure out the impact when you move from redistribution to markets. Who wins and who loses? What kind of advantages do the people who did well in the old system have when you move to a new system? Does it move from a planned economy to a market economy? Does that enhance the privileges, give new opportunities to the people with power and privilege? Or does it make them decline through time, since markets involve competition, and presumably those with ability will do better than those without? It's a big debate about returns to something called political capital versus human capital. And if you go through the journals in sociology, and to some extent economics, you'll see article after article with survey data trying to figure out who's winning and who's losing based upon whether they have political or human capital. Now the problem is, the story was always mixed. The story was always mixed. It's clear that some groups were advancing who did not do well in the previous system. For example, ordinary farmers in China did much better after the shift to a market economy than under a planned economy. But on the other hand, people who used to have positions or still have positions in these political systems often seem to do quite well. So how do you solve the puzzle then? And the argument usually was, well, we haven't completed the transition to a market economy. Well, what does that mean? It means we haven't completed the process of privatization. So it turned out there were other assumptions about what was going on underneath the surface that meant you had finally arrived at a true market economy. Through time, especially if you compare the approach to privatization in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, or some of the smaller Eastern European countries, to China, one of the things we noticed right away was that China moved to private property and privatization much more cautiously after a long delay and in a much more peaceful fashion. So we immediately noticed that there were big differences across these different transitional economies, these 34 transitional economies, that had to do with state policy, with what kind of government they had, and how quickly they wanted to transform the economy and in what direction. And the more we thought about this, the more we looked at what actually happened in these countries, it was clear that the idea that you move from something called state socialist, state property, to full privatization was really an ideal type that very rarely actually fit with what happened across these different countries. And China was an outstanding case of working creatively with different definitions of property that weren't quite total privatization, except in certain areas. Nonetheless, in China, even though the process was dragged out and slow and gradual, over 20 or 30 years now, there have been radical changes in the use of property in its organization and its deployment as economic assets. And as these uses have changed, the value of these old assets have also changed. Now, let's revisit property under state socialism. It's owned and controlled by government jurisdictions or by firms. Property can't be deployed purely for profit. Labor is not expendable. By that I mean you can't raise profits by laying off labor. Labor is basically part of the cost of production and one of the reasons for that form of socialism. The purpose of enterprises are simply to provide inputs for the planned economy, and it's an economy premised on growth and output, and to create welfare distributed broadly across the population. Assets can't be bought or sold. They can be transferred by the government to different uses, but they aren't bought and sold between firms. Income flows to government jurisdictions ultimately and is redistributed to other firms and to the population. And by distinctive organizational demography, that's a term from organizational demography, which means that in a market economy, firms are constantly being created and they're constantly going out of business. They're being born and they're dying. Okay? In a state socialist firm, they're born, but they don't die. They survive, they're propped up, and so forth. And this is one of the main reasons why through time, the dynamism of these economies ultimately could not compete. Those economies that had a lot of startups and had a lot of old outmoded firms that simply went out of business. So, gradually through time, it's become clear, and I think David Stark, a sociologist at Columbia now, was one of the first to put it this way. We shouldn't think about ownership change as a shift from state to private. We should call it privatization. We should think of it in terms of asset conversion. And there are a number of things you can do. If you look at property rights from the perspective of law and economics, you can divide different kinds of rights that really are a bundle of property rights. One is use. Who controls them? For what purposes? Who decides when to use them? Second is income. Who has the rights to what flows of income from assets? And third is the right to buy and sell the assets, to ultimately transfer those rights to other users. Okay? When you have all three of those, that's privatization. That's full privatization. When you have only one or two of those, that's something that's very commonly been employed in China's transitional economy. When you do this, you're creating a different kind of society because the rules about who is transferred, who receives these rights can vary greatly. Let me give you an example. If you have a collective farm where farmers have to work there, they can't be expelled, and you want to move to some kind of private agriculture, what's the first step? Well, one step, which was very common early in the economic history of capitalist countries like England or France, much later, was to give the rights to a landlord who would control large tracts of land, and then that landlord would expel the farmers that are there. Okay? That means you have a large landed elite, and you have farmers who previously farmed lots of land that they had rights to, but now have to be wage laborers. They can either work as wage labor on these large estates, or they have to migrate to cities. Okay, so China could have done that, I suppose, in the late 1970s. They didn't do that. Okay? Another alternative would be to privatize the land to the households, each household that's there. Privatize meaning giving them full rights. Use, control, and transfer. In other words, and they're talking about doing this now in China, eventually still debating it. What that would do, that would create small holding farmers who had the right to sell their farms and go somewhere else. Now what that did was, and I think the reason why the government in China did not do that, is that they worried that farmers who were cash short or who suffered a bad harvest would be forced to sell their land, and then would become a landless proletariat, would migrate to the cities, would form slums and so forth, and pretty much you'd end up looking like an impoverished country in Latin America. They did not do it that way. And instead, they gave the farm households use rights and income rights, but did not give them the rights to transfer those assets elsewhere. They're now discussing whether or not it would be smart to do that in the future. Okay? So in other words, how you decide to carve up these property rights has a huge social implication for inequality. Okay? Now, and when you do that, you're creating these social groups, and potentially in the process of changing, you're creating social conflicts. Okay? Now, if you also look at the assets, I mean, this is the case of land and farmland, but if you're talking about a large state-owned steel complex or a large manufacturing, state-owned manufacturing firm, you can't divide that up the way you divide land. Okay? If you're talking about real estate, that's a sector that wasn't organized as an economic sector under a planned economy. So it's really very much a mixed bag, and you have to look very carefully at how policy changes transform property relationships in different spheres of the economy. It's very hard to generalize. Think about it. It's very hard to generalize about, well, what are the implications of market transactions for inequality? You really can't. It can't be defined unless you specify, well, who gets what when you divide up the state-owned property. So what I'd like to do here is just illustrate quickly three different sectors and make the point that there are qualitative differences in the assets, there are qualitative differences in the people who are involved and who are affected by these changes, and there are real policy choices to be made by governments to make change quickly or not, and how much of which property rights to give to what groups. It's really quite flexible and much more It's much more flexible and nuanced than we ever thought at the beginning. And after all, no one in the late 1970s and early 1980s, late 1980s, had ever seen this kind of market transition occur. So we really didn't have any models for describing. So I'll talk about the iron and steel industry, which is really an example of a traditional large-scale heavy industry, which was the backbone of the old socialist economy. Then I'll talk about the growth of a new commercial real estate development sector, which is absolutely new. It's become one of the biggest and most important drivers of economic growth in China. And third, household agriculture, and I very briefly gave you an example of that. This was the earliest reform in the early 1980s, really began with experiments in the late 1970s. So, iron and steel. Okay, this is the backbone of the old system. These large, comprehensive state-owned enterprises were the classic example of the kind of company that had to be restructured, that were not creative enough, were not advanced enough, were not dynamic enough to permit the survival of Soviet-style socialism. There's been just a remarkable transformation in this sector. I talked about it briefly last week at another presentation here. It's been a remarkably successful restructuring. It has been remarkably radical, despite the fact that it did not, by and large, involve privatization. And it's led to a steel sector that's just taken off. China is now the dominant steel producer in the world by far. In 1989, China ranked the distant fourth in the world. Since that time, steel output has increased eightfold. By 2009, it was the largest steel sector, national steel sector in the world. 5 times the next largest, which was Japan. Now, if you looked at back in 1989, who were the big steel producers? Japan was number 1, USSR number 2, and so forth. The United States was still hanging in there, but barely by its fingernails. In the interim, China's steel sector revolutionized. Thousands of new small mills have emerged, but the large socialist steel companies were radically restructured. Now, the problem was they had outdated technology. They had many more workers than they needed to do the work that they had to do. And they had very heavy welfare and pension obligations that accumulated over the years. They needed massive investment in new technologies. They needed to radically reduce the size of their labor forces. And they proceeded to do so. And in the first 15 years, they tried simply to give existing firms responsibility for their own profits and losses. This was a strategy of market reform pursued in Hungary before the collapse of socialism there. And by the time China was pursuing this strategy in the 1980s, Kornai, a Hungarian economist named Kornai, was becoming world famous for pointing out that this approach wouldn't work because the government still owned them, the government still had a stake in keeping them in business, and was constantly bargaining with firms when they ran into difficulty taking excess profits from firms that were doing well and giving it to propping up the firms that were not doing well. By the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, it was clear that this reform approach was not working. There were some very large bankruptcies of some of the larger steel firms in China. And it was at that point that China's economic bureaucrats, leaders, came up with a completely new way of thinking about restructuring in a way that no one talked about at the beginning in the early 1980s. What they did was they carved off the non-productive assets and the welfare parts of these large community-type firms, so the housing and the kindergartens and the medical centers and so forth were carved off and mostly given to municipal governments. And they kept the productive assets, and they also moved off a number of the excess workers to these to various kinds of new institutions outside the firm itself, and then enlisted them on stock exchange, increasingly first domestic stock exchanges, then in Hong Kong, and then internationally beyond Hong Kong. And they raised capital this way, but they remained state-owned. So they looked on the surface like any kind of global corporation, but at least 50% of these shares were non-tradable. So the state government, the central government, or the municipal government, provincial government, maintain control over the assets. They also maintain control over the appointment of top personnel, and so forth. Now, what this meant was you did not get, in China, the kind of thing you saw in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, where for very deeply discounted prices, people who had started some of the first banks were basically given the nickel-producing firms or the steel firms, and that was the old case of the oligarchs. Okay? Led to highly unequal distribution of benefits from the old system. This did not happen in these traditional state-owned sectors because existing management did not have large private stakes in them. Now, the result was that the sector took off, and if you charted output, it would go way up, and if you looked at employment, it went down, and these things crossed during the 1990s and into the 2000s. So while China's state sector, still state sector, but restructured state firms in iron and steel became the world leaders, they really downsized in a radical way. Now, the interesting and ironic thing about this is that everyone, all the theorists and all the sociologists at the beginning, thought that this kind of radical restructuring would be terrible for labor forces and would be good for management who would become large-scale business people simply by being in the right place at the right time. It would create a highly unequal situation. That is, that privatization would do this. Now, what's happening in China is that you get the restructuring, very deep restructuring, without the creation of large-scale private oligarchs like you saw in Russia. What's also ironic is that privatization in Russia did not lead to this outcome. When they gave ownership shares to the existing managers in the workforce, they created alliances that prevented outsiders from coming in and restructuring the firms. So what happened in many of these formerly these privatized state firms is they didn't restructure, they didn't change management, they didn't drastically reduce their labor forces or sell themselves off. They did everything they could to stay in existence. And so they stopped paying workers their salaries, instead gave them products to go out and sell, and so forth. You had a huge increase in the barter trade in Russia. So one of the ironic things about China's approach to property reform in the steel sector, they did so in a creative way that worked. It also prevented some of the worst abuses and some of the worst failures of full-scale privatization, which was carried out very early and very rapidly in Russia. Now, it wasn't a smooth process, and for much of the 1990s and early 2000s, most of what you read about what was going on in China had to do with laid-off workers protesting, arguing that they were not being given the compensation that they wanted, and so forth. That was largely confined to Rust Belt cities in China, Northeast in particular, out the far west in Sichuan, single company towns, really. On occasion, this would lead to violence, but this is largely a thing of the past because the process of restructuring is over. And I think we can now say that that was not only a startling approach and a creative approach, but it was highly successful. It's hard to argue, certainly in the case of iron and steel, that was not a great success. Now, let's move to commercial real estate, which is a fundamentally different situation. This sector did not exist before. There's no question of restructuring existing firms. There's no labor force to lay off. Okay? Real property was controlled by work units, by organizations, and city governments. So downsizing is not an issue at all. But the special feature of this asset to make it commercially viable is that you have to consolidate parcels. That's one of the things you have to do in order to redevelop urban space. And anyone who traveled in China in the late 70s and early 80s knows that the cities were really in very bad shape. Housing just deeply deteriorated over that period of time. Now, this created a new opportunity for city governments, okay? Because the city governments, the state owns the land. City governments control it. And they're not allowed to sell the underlying ownership rights. It's actually China's real estate system is patterned after Hong Kong's, which means that you can sell use rights for a certain period of time. Now you get payments for land use. It's a new source of revenue for city governments who are badly in need of it. And it's also, after the property is redeveloped, you get taxes from the new businesses that are there, okay? So it's a very important new way that you fund municipal services, okay? But mayors and party secretaries don't have any experience in property development. They might have people who know about construction, they might have surveyors, so forth, but they don't know how to put together a real estate development firm. So, unlike in steel and iron, there was a big opportunity here for private investment, for existing firms, for new firms that were formed within China, to create real estate development firms, for foreign firms to come in and to partner with government and redevelop the cities. And this became a dynamic new sector of the economy that did not exist before. Now, on the one hand, this meant that because many of the key real estate development firms were privately owned, or if they were listed on stock exchanges, there usually was a majority controlling share by some private entity. There were also large state-owned or hybrid firms. But this was a sector where you did see the creation of private wealth. Okay? It was possible to make fortunes, unlike, it's much more limited in iron and steel. So if you looked at the Hurun list or the Forbes list of the wealthiest Chinese, roughly 40% come somehow from real estate property development. Okay? Now, there's a flip side to this, however. And that is, and here's another case where policy choices make a difference. Now, you know, the city governments could have said, well, okay, since most of the people in these existing homes don't have private deeds, and since they don't really have any property rights in them, we can simply sell all these buildings to property developers, and then they have to rent them at market rates. Well, that obviously would have been terrible for the people, and most of them would have had to move out. But what they did instead is, while this property real estate development was growing as an industry, beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and basically finished by 2005, it still goes on to some extent, was a privatization of the existing housing stock. In other words, the occupants of their homes were given the opportunity to purchase them at deep, deep discounts. And what you ended up by the early 2000s were rates of home ownership in Chinese cities that were much, much higher than in market economies. 80% is the number by some surveys in 2002, 2003. The comparable number for countries like the United States is about 55% of people own their own homes. So, on the one hand, you have this dynamic, private, market-oriented economy that's a new sector. On the other hand, you have a transfer of enormous wealth to ordinary citizens. And in fact, if you think about it, unless you give ordinary households some home equity, they can't participate in new markets for housing. It generates new demand. And some of the data that we have, this is actually common across virtually all of the transitional economies, that there have been trillions and trillions of US dollars that are transferred to ordinary households in this process. This becomes, in almost every case, the major component of household wealth immediately after the privatization of housing. Okay, so that's a second. Qualitatively, very different. Who wins, who loses, what kinds of opportunities there are, really quite different from steel. Now, household farming, finally. We're talking about a land reform that began in 79 to 83 or so, the end of collective agriculture. The primary asset of value in Chinese agriculture at that time was land. It was not mechanized. Okay? And the most important input was labor, and to some extent fertilizer, chemical fertilizer in most cases. And what was transferred to households were partial property rights, that is, control families gained control over plots. It became their farm, and they could earn income from those plots. They could not buy and sell those plots to one another. And because land is an asset, unlike steel, that's inherently divisible, it was divided up almost universally and very, very equally in China during this period. And this stage of reform generated almost no conflict. Farmers were very, very happy, by and large, about this change. The knowledge of how to use this asset, how to farm, was widely distributed. Still basically labor-based agriculture. Again, this is unlike steel or real estate. The result was that rural incomes went up rapidly, and agriculture became highly productive during the 1980s. Now, later, however, you did get social conflicts that showed that something had fundamentally changed in the countryside. Assets continued, that is, the land continued to be controlled. In the old days, in agriculture, the assets were controlled and managed by rural cadres. All the income came to the collective coffers. The cadres decided what to farm and how to market it and so forth. And the income was held collectively. But when you move to household agriculture, all of a sudden, the way in which income from agriculture supports government radically shifts. Under collective farm, you take the overhead, you pay the salaries of the officials, and you fund local government, and it's invisible, because what people get at the end of the year is what's left over. Now you have household farms that are making their own money, and you have to get money from them. You have to tax them. Okay? And taxation is a sensitive thing. It caused the American Revolution, and so forth, and it created real arguments in villages for the first time about things like fees and taxes. During the 1980s and early 1990s, there were lots of conflicts about so-called peasant burdens. Okay? They gradually worked this out, and early in the Hu Jintao era, they abolished the taxes and so forth, and had rural officials stop extracting fees. Then they shifted to another source of income, which was, because they still controlled the underlying land, they could bring in developers, they could bring in factories, clear off the farmers from a certain part of the land, give them compensation, and then bring in, sell the land rights to outside enterprises who invested in the village. And also then created a stream of tax revenues after that, in addition to employment for some of the local people. But that led to a second kind of conflict, which was over land tenure, which you did not have earlier. So the transformation in rural areas, what they're talking about now in China is, would it make more sense to finally give farmers full ownership rights? Because now they're thinking about urbanization. Do we need all these people to still be permanently tied to the land? So economists are now saying, wouldn't it make more sense for them to be able to sell that land, which gives them a stake to move into nearby small towns and buy a home and start a new life there? So that's the argument. The argument against it is, well, maybe they'll be forced to sell out with a bad harvest, and they won't get enough from the land, and you'll create a new reservoir of landless rural poor. That's the other side of the argument. Now, conclusions. The focus on property instead of on market transactions, and thinking about asset conversion as a kind of a varied process helps us to understand who wins and who loses in a very nuanced way, and also why. And I think it gives us a realistic and more effective analysis of social change. The impact varies greatly, even in a single economy like China's. It varies greatly across different countries who have different kinds of governments with different kinds of interest groups and pass different kinds of policies. So what we used to call marketization as if it was a single process that led from one point to another, or privatization as if it led from state to fully private, really didn't help us very much to understand. Now that we can look back over 20, 30 years of change in a country like China, for example, we can see that the process is really quite different. So again, steel industry, you have to restructure firms, you have to lay off people, you have to take away some of the old welfare guarantees without privatization. Lest I leave you with the idea that the laid off steel workers were left with absolutely nothing, keep in mind that their homes were also being privatized to them in this process, which gave them something of a stake when they were released onto the labor market. And you don't get the creation of huge concentrations of private wealth. Real estate, a brand new sector, greater participation by private firms. You get something that looks more like a business accumulation of private wealth in this sector. There's no layoffs, there's no prior labor force that gets abused or loses rights. And you get a rising employment of rural migrants in the construction trade, and perhaps also some of the laid off steel workers. And you have privatization of existing housing assets to a very large part of the population, urban population, almost very close to universal home ownership, which is a huge transfer of wealth to ordinary people and creates the foundations for an urban middle class. Finally, agriculture, you have the transfer of extensive use rights to farmers, but not complete ownership, which is something that's prevented the formation of a large group of landless, poor peasants in China that migrates to cities permanently. Farmers can't sell their land up to now or move off. They can rent it. There are constraints on the creation of this rural landed class, and there's no new rural elite comparable to landlord classes in other countries that have highly unequal ownership of land. And you have rising household prosperity, but again, new conflicts over extraction and over land tenure. So there's been a property revolution in China. It's been slow, it's been quiet, it's taken place steadily over 30 years, and the ownership pattern in China has changed radically. There's been relatively little by what we originally thought of privatization in the textbook sense. And the answer, if you ask, well, who won and who lost, it depends on the sector. But in many of these sectors, ordinary people actually gained a great deal because certainly farmers gained rights over their land, and ordinary people were given basically equity to participate in markets. So with that,